A murder is announced!
At Little Paddocks.
At 6:30 this evening.
In the sleepy village of Chipping Cleghorn, a chilling newspaper ad shocks the residents. A murder is announced at Little Paddocks, 6:30 p.m. What seems like a prank turns deadly when a young man is shot, and Miss Letitia Blacklock barely escapes with a graze. As bodies pile up, Miss Jane Marple unravels a web of deception, revealing a hidden sister, a stolen identity, and a deadly plot for a fortune. Secrets, lies, and murder collide in this gripping Agatha Christie mystery, where no one is who they seem. Chapter 1. The Curious Advertisement. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Chipping Cleghorn, a village so unremarkable that its residents took pride in their uneventful days. On this particular Friday, however, the postman's arrival sparked a ripple of intrigue. Tucked within the pages of the North Benham News and Chipping Cleghorn Gazette, a modest sheet known for lost cats and church fates, lay an advertisement that defied the village's quiet rhythm. In the personal column, printed in crisp black ink, it read, "A murder is announced and will take place on Friday, October 29th at Little Paddocks at 6:30 p.m. Friends, please accept this, the only intimation." Mrs. Clipp, the postmistress, was the first to notice. Her spectacles slid down her nose as she read it aloud to Miss Hartnell, who had come to buy stamps. A murder at Little Paddocks? What nonsense! Miss Hartnell declared, her voice carrying to the butcher's queue across the street. By noon, the advertisement was the talk of every parlour and shop. At the Bluebird Cafe, Colonel Easterbrook, retired and fond of his own opinions, suggested it was a tasteless prank, while his wife Laura wondered if it might be a newfangled game from London. Miss Hinchcliffe, striding past with a basket of apples, snorted at the idea. "Sounds like someone's got too much time on their hands," she said to her companion, Amy Murgatroyd, who nodded nervously. At Little Paddocks, a handsome Georgian house with ivy creeping up its stone walls, Miss Letitia Blacklock received the Gazette with her breakfast tray. She was a woman of about 60, her dark hair streaked with silver, her posture erect, and her manner calm yet authoritative. As she unfolded the paper, her cousin Patrick Simmons, a lanky young man with a charming grin, lounged across the table, teasing the housekeeper, Mitzi, about her burnt toast. Mitzi, a refugee with a flair for drama, muttered something in her native tongue and slammed a teapot down. Letitia's friend Dora Bunner, a fluttery woman with a faded prettiness, peered over her shoulder. "What's that, Letty? A murder! Here!" Her voice rose, drawing the attention of Patrick's sister, Julia, who looked up from her novel with a bored expression. Philippa Hames, a quiet widow who boarded at the house, paused in the act of buttering her bread, her pale eyes curious. Letitia read the advertisement aloud, her tone dry. "It's absurd. Probably some child's idea of a joke." But her fingers tightened on the paper, and a faint crease appeared between her brows. Patrick laughed, suggesting they invite the village to see the murder unfold. "Might liven things up," he said, winking at Julia, who rolled her eyes. Dora, however, was less amused. "It's sinister, Letty. What if someone means harm?" Letitia dismissed the notion, but agreed to expect a few curious neighbours at 6:30. "If it's a prank, we'll send them packing with sherry and a laugh," she said, though her smile didn't reach her eyes. Word of the advertisement reached Meddenham Wells, where Miss Jane Marple, a frail figure with fluffy white hair and deceptively mild blue eyes, was staying with her nephew's wife, Joan. A letter from Mrs. Finch, a Chipping Cleghorn acquaintance, mentioned the odd notice in passing. Miss Marple, seated by the window with her knitting, paused, her needles still. "A murder announced," she murmured. Her mind, sharp as ever despite her age, turned over the words. She had seen too many village intrigues to dismiss it as mere folly. People, she knew, did not advertise crimes without reason. Whether mischief or something darker, she resolved to visit Chipping Cleghorn, ostensibly to call on old friends, but her curiosity was piqued. Back in the village, the day wore on with a hum of anticipation. Edmund Whodunit, a bookish young man with aspirations to write, debated, with his mother Mrs. Whodunit, whether to attend the event at Little Paddocks. "It's probably nothing," Edmund said, but his mother, ever eager for gossip, insisted they go. At the vicarage, the Reverend Julian Harmon and his wife Bunch puzzled over the notice. "It's not like Letitia to play games," Bunch said, frowning. "She's far too sensible." The vicar, peering over his sermon notes, suggested it might be a misunderstanding, but Bunch wasn't convinced. As evening approached, Little Paddocks prepared for its uninvited guests. Mitzi, muttering about mad English villages, polished glasses in the drawing-room. Patrick and Julia bickered over who should answer the door, while Dora fussed with cushions, her hands trembling. Philippa, silent as usual, watched from a corner, her thoughts unreadable. Letitia, in a tailored dress that spoke of understated wealth, surveyed the room with a practised eye. The clock ticked towards 6:30, and the air grew thick with expectation. Outside, the first neighbours approached, their footsteps crunching on the gravel drive, drawn by a notice that promised something Chipping Cleghorn had never seen. A murder, announced as boldly as a garden party. Chapter 2. The Gathering at Little Paddocks. The October evening draped Chipping Cleghorn in a chill mist, and the lights of Little Paddocks glowed like a beacon against the gathering dusk. The Georgian house, with its symmetrical windows and ivy-clad walls, stood at the end of a winding lane, its presence both inviting and faintly imposing. Inside, the drawing-room hummed with the low murmur of voices, the clink of glasses, and the occasional burst of nervous laughter. Miss Letitia Blacklock, the mistress of the house, moved among her guests with a practised grace, her dark eyes alert beneath her composed exterior. The advertisement in the Gazette, announcing a murder at 6:30 p.m, had drawn a curious crowd, and though Letitia had dismissed it as a prank, the air was thick with anticipation. The room was a study in contrasts, elegant but lived in, with polished mahogany furniture and faded chintz curtains. A fire crackled in the grate, casting shadows on the walls, where family portraits hung alongside a few modern watercolours. On a sideboard, a tray held a decanter of sherry, a bottle of gin, and an assortment of glasses, some chipped from years of use. Mitzi, the housekeeper, flitted about with a tray of canapes, her dark hair escaping its bun, her expression a mix of resentment and anxiety. "Always, I must serve, serve, serve," she muttered under her breath, thrusting a plate of cheese straws at Colonel Easterbrook, who took one absent-mindedly. Colonel Easterbrook, retired from the Indian Army, stood by the fireplace, his moustache bristling as he recounted a tale of a tiger hunt to Edmund Swettenham, who listened with polite boredom. Edmund, a lanky young man with ink-stained fingers and a penchant for poetry, had come with his mother, Mrs. Swettenham, a plump woman whose eyes darted about, collecting gossip like a magpie. Such an odd thing, this announcement, Mrs. Swettenham said to Laura Easterbrook, the Colonel's younger wife, who nodded vaguely, her attention on her reflection in a nearby mirror. Laura, with her sleek blonde hair and tailored dress, seemed out of place in the village's homely setting, her mind clearly elsewhere. Miss Hinchcliffe and Amy Murgatroyd, inseparable friends who shared a cottage and a passion for gardening, occupied a corner near the window. Miss Hinchcliffe, broad-shouldered and blunt, sipped her sherry with a scowl. If this is someone's idea of fun, they've got a queer sense of humour, she said, her voice carrying. Amy, smaller and more timid, clutched her glass, her eyes wide. "Oh, Hinch, do you think something awful will happen?" she whispered. But Miss Hinchcliffe only snorted and patted her arm. The household of Little Paddocks was equally on edge. Patrick Simmons, Letitia's cousin, lounged against the mantelpiece, his boyish charm masking a restless energy. He teased Julia, his sister, who sat on a sofa, her legs crossed elegantly, a cigarette burning between her fingers. Julia's cool, almost insolent beauty drew glances from the men in the room, but her expression was one of detached amusement, as if the gathering were a tiresome play she was forced to watch. Dora Bunner, Letitia's old friend, fluttered about, her faded blue dress clinging to her thin frame. "It's all so exciting, isn't it?" Dora said to no one in particular, her voice high and brittle, like something out of a film. Philippa Hames, the quiet widow who boarded at the house, stood apart, her hands clasped in front of her simple grey dress. Her pale face was composed, but her eyes flickered toward the clock, which read 6:25 Letitia, circulating with a tray of drinks, paused to exchange pleasantries with the Reverend Julian Harmon and his wife Bunch, who had arrived late, apologizing for a parish meeting that ran over. Bunch, with her round face and untidy brown hair, looked more like a cheerful schoolgirl than a vicar's wife. "Letty, you must be furious about that advertisement," she said, accepting a glass of sherry. "Who'd do such a thing?" Letitia's smile was tight. "Some fool with too much time, I expect, but we'll make the best of it. More gin, Julian?" The vicar, a gentle man with a scholarly air, declined, his attention caught by a book on the side table, a volume of Tennyson, well worn. As the clock's hands crept closer to 6:30, the room grew quieter, the chatter giving way to an uneasy silence. Guests glanced at one another, half expecting a joke to be revealed. A parlour game, perhaps, or a theatrical flourish. Patrick, sensing the tension, clapped his hands. "Come on, everyone, let's not look so glum. If it's a murder, at least it's a punctual one." His laugh broke the spell momentarily, and a few guests smiled, though Dora's giggle was shrill, and Mitzi dropped a plate of biscuits, earning a sharp glance from Letitia. At precisely 6:30, the lights went out. The room plunged into darkness, the fire's glow casting eerie shapes on the walls. A gasp rippled through the guests, followed by a stifled scream from Amy Murgatroyd. Before anyone could speak, a man's voice, harsh and unfamiliar, barked from the doorway, "Hands up, all of you!" The command was followed by the click of a torch, its beam sweeping the room, dazzling the guests. 2 shots rang out, sharp and deafening, splitting the air. A woman, Dora perhaps, cried out, and there was a scuffle near the door. Then a 3rd shot, different in tone, followed by a heavy thud. The torch went out, and for a moment the only sounds were ragged breathing and the crackle of the fire. Patrick, closest to the light switch, fumbled in the dark and flicked it on. The room blazed with light, revealing a scene of chaos. Near the door, a young man lay sprawled on the floor, blood pooling beneath his head. A revolver, its barrel glinting, rested inches from his outstretched hand. Letitia stood frozen, her hand pressed to her neck, where a thin trickle of blood seeped through her fingers, staining her pearl necklace. Her face was pale, but her eyes were wide with shock rather than pain. Dora, trembling, clung to Julia, who pushed her away impatiently. Mitzi screamed, a high, keening sound, and dropped to her knees, babbling incoherently. Colonel Easterbrook, his military instincts kicking, strode to the body and knelt beside it. "Dead!" he pronounced, his voice grim. "Shot through the temple." The young man was Rudy Schertz, a clerk at the Royal Spa Hotel in Meddenham Wells, known to the village as a polite, if slightly flashy foreigner, with a penchant for charming elderly guests. His presence in Little Paddocks, revolver in hand, was as baffling as the advertisement itself. Mrs. Swettenham, peering over the Colonel's shoulder, gasped, "But I saw him only last week at the hotel. What was he doing here?" Edmund, standing protectively near Philippa, muttered, "This is no game." Philippa's face remained impassive, but her hands tightened in her lap. Bunch Harmon, practical despite her shock, fetched a glass of water for Letitia, who waved it away. "I'm all right," Letitia said, her voice steadying. "It's just a graze. The bullet must have clipped me." She touched her neck again, wincing, and accepted a handkerchief from the vicar. Miss Hinchcliffe, ever direct, demanded, "What the devil was that about? Some lunatic playing bandit?" Amy Murgatroyd, pale and shaking, clung to her friend's arm, unable to speak. Laura Easterbrook, who had shrieked during the commotion, now sat fanning herself, her composure fraying. "It's dreadful," she murmured, as if to herself. "Simply dreadful." Patrick, his earlier levity gone, crossed to the body and stared down at Rudy. "Poor blighter," he said softly, then glanced at Letitia. "Aunt Letty, you're sure you're not hurt?" His concern seemed genuine, but Julia's sharp glance suggested she found it excessive. Dora, recovering slightly, began to babble. "It was so dark, Letty, and that voice, oh, it was horrible. I thought we were all going to die." Letitia, with a touch of impatience, said, "Pull yourself together. Bunny, we're alive, aren't we?" Colonel Easterbrook, taking charge, suggested someone telephone the police. The vicar volunteered, hurrying to the hall where the telephone stood on a polished oak table. Within minutes he returned, confirming that Inspector Craddock was on his way from Milchester. The guests, uncertain whether to stay or leave, milled about, their voices hushed. Mitzi, still kneeling, muttered about murderers in the dark, until Julia snapped, "For heaven's sake, Mitzi, stop it!" The housekeeper glared but fell silent, retreating to the kitchen with a slam of the door. Letitia, now seated on a sofa, allowed Bunch to bandage her neck with a clean napkin. "It's nothing serious," she insisted, though her hands trembled slightly. She looked around the room, her gaze lingering on each guest, as if searching for an answer in their faces. Patrick hovered nearby, while Julia lit another cigarette, her movements deliberate. Philippa, who had barely spoken, rose and began collecting scattered glasses, her calm a stark contrast to the room's tension. Mrs. Whodunit, unable to resist, whispered to Laura Easterbrook, "Do you think it was a robbery gone wrong, or something personal?" Laura, pale beneath her makeup, only shook her head. Miss Hinchcliffe, pacing near the window, stopped suddenly. "That voice," she said, frowning. "It didn't sound like Rudy's. I've heard him at the hotel. High-pitched, almost squeaky. That shout was deeper." Amy, emboldened by her friend's confidence, nodded. "Yes, Hinch is right. It wasn't the same." The observation hung in the air, unnoticed by most, but sowing a seed of doubt. Colonel Easterbrook, overhearing, rubbed his chin. Could have been an accomplice, he mused, but the idea seemed too outlandish for the cosy confines of Little Paddocks. The vicar, returning from a second call, announced that a doctor would also attend, to examine both Rudy's body and Letitia's injury. The guests, now resigned to waiting, settled into uneasy groups. Edmund, drawn to Philippa's quiet strength, offered to help with the glasses, but she declined with a faint smile. Dora, still shaken, sat beside Letitia, clutching her hand. "Oh, Letty, what if they come back?" she whispered. Letitia patted her arm absently, her mind elsewhere. Patrick, restless, began examining the revolver, but Colonel Easterbrook stopped him. "Best leave it for the police, lad," he said firmly. The sound of a car engine cut through the murmurs, and headlights flashed across the windows. Inspector Dermot Craddock, a lean man with sharp grey eyes, and a manner both courteous and commanding, entered, followed by a sergeant and a police doctor. Craddock's gaze swept the room, taking in the dishevelled guests, the body by the door, and Letitia's bloodied handkerchief. "Good evening," he said, his tone clipped. "I understand there's been a shooting. Miss Blacklock, are you injured?" Letitia, rising, assured him it was minor, and the doctor, a brisk man named Harris, examined her neck, confirming the wound was superficial. A bullet had grazed her earlobe, nothing more. Craddock knelt beside Rudy's body, his expression unreadable. "Shot at close range," he noted, glancing at the revolver. "We'll need to confirm if this was the weapon." He turned to the guests, his voice calm but firm. "I'll need statements from everyone present. No one is to leave until we've spoken." A murmur of assent followed, though Mrs. Whodunit looked faintly indignant, as if her social standing exempted her from such inconvenience. Laura Easterbrook, regaining her poise, adjusted her scarf and offered a wan smile, while Colonel Easterbrook stood at attention, ready to assist. As Craddock began his questions, starting with Letitia, the room settled into a tense vigil. The fire had died down, and the air grew colder, mirroring the chill that had settled over Little Paddocks. The advertisement, once a curiosity, had become a grim reality, and the guests, bound by shock and suspicion, waited for answers. Outside, the mist thickened, cloaking the village in secrecy, as if Chipping Cleghorn itself were holding its breath. Chapter 3. The Inspector's Inquiry. The morning after the shooting at Little Paddocks, Chipping Cleghorn awoke under a pall of unease. The mist had lifted, but a grey sky hung low, mirroring the village's subdued mood. In the police station, at Milchester, a squat brick building with peeling paint, Inspector Dermot Craddock sat at a cluttered desk, his sharp grey eyes scanning a preliminary report on Rudy Schertz's death. The revolver, a Webley .38, had been confirmed as the murder weapon, with 2 bullets fired into the wall and a 3rd through Rudy's temple. Letitia Blacklock's graze was minor, but the implications of the night's events were anything but. Craddock, a man who trusted facts over intuition, felt a nagging sense that the advertised murder was no simple robbery gone awry. At Little Paddocks, the household was in disarray. Letitia, her neck bandaged, sat in the morning room, a cup of tea untouched before her. Her composure, though frayed, held firm as she answered Craddock's questions, delivered with a courtesy that belied their probing nature. The room, with its chintz armchairs and a vase of late roses, seemed an incongruous setting for talk of violence. Patrick Simmons slouched in a corner, his usual charm dimmed by fatigue, while Julia, elegant in a navy sweater, perched on a window seat, her expression unreadable. Dora Bunner, red-eyed and clutching a handkerchief, hovered near Letitia, her nervous chatter filling the silences. Philippa Hames, ever reserved, sat knitting, her needles clicking rhythmically, while Mitzi, summoned from the kitchen, stood by the door, her apron twisted in her hands. Craddock began with Letitia. "Miss Blacklock, you knew Rudy Scherz from the Royal Spa Hotel, correct?" Letitia nodded, her voice steady. "Yes, I stayed there last summer. He was a clerk, always polite, though a bit forward. I was shocked to see him last night." Craddock pressed. Had she spoken to him recently? Letitia denied it, insisting their last encounter was months ago. Her alibi for the afternoon before the shooting, shopping in Milchester, was corroborated by receipts. But Craddock noted a slight hesitation in her manner, as if she were choosing her words with care. Turning to Patrick, Craddock asked about his movements. Patrick, running a hand through his tousled hair, said he'd been at the house all day, studying for university exams. "I thought the advertisement was a lark," he admitted. "Never imagined it'd end like that." His casual tone grated on Craddock, who sensed a guardedness beneath the young man's nonchalance. Julia, questioned next, was brisk, claiming she'd been reading in her room until the guests arrived. Her cool detachment intrigued Craddock. She seemed less shaken than the others, her dark eyes meeting his without flinching. Dora Bunner's interview was less straightforward. Her answers veered into tangents, her voice quavering as she spoke of Letitia's financier brother, Randall Godler, whose death years ago had left a fortune tied up in a trust. "Letty will inherit it all when Sonia, Randall's widow, passes," Dora said, then faltered, as if unsure she should have mentioned it. Craddock, jotting notes, asked if anyone else benefited from the will. Dora hesitated, glancing at Letitia, then mumbled about a distant relative. "Some boy, I think." Her confusion was genuine, but Craddock wondered if her scatterbrained demeanour hid something more. Philippa Hames, when questioned, spoke softly, her words precise. She'd been gardening until dusk, then joined the gathering. "I didn't. No Rudy," she said, her gaze steady. "I thought it was a prank, like everyone else." Her calm was almost unnerving, and Craddock noted her hands, calloused from work, suggesting a life of quiet struggle. Mitzi, last to be questioned, was a whirlwind of emotion, "I see nothing," she cried, her accent thick. "But in the dark, there was another. Someone moving, I swear." Her claim of a second figure intrigued Craddock, though her hysteria made it hard to credit. He dismissed her gently, promising to follow up. As the interviews concluded, Craddock's sergeant, a stolid man named Fletcher, arrived with news from the Royal Spa Hotel. Rudy Schertz had a record of petty theft, pilfering from guests' rooms, and Dean had been sacked from a Swiss hotel before coming to England. "A chancer," Fletcher said, "but no history of violence." Craddock frowned, puzzled by Rudy's role. Was he a hired thug, or had he stumbled into something larger? The advertisement suggested planning, yet Rudy's death felt chaotic, almost accidental. Meanwhile, in Meddenham Wells, Miss Jane Marple sat in her nephew's cosy parlour, a skein of pale blue wool in her lap. The vicar's wife, Bunch Harmon, had visited that morning, recounting the shooting with wide-eyed horror. Poor Letty, grazed by a bullet, and that boy dead on her floor. Bunch's words sparked Miss Marple's curiosity, and she accepted an invitation to tea at the Chipping Cleghorn vicarage, hoping to learn more. As she boarded the bus to the village, her mind turned over the facts. An announced murder, a dead intruder, a wounded hostess. It was, she thought, like a puzzle with too many edges. At the vicarage, a rambling house filled with books and the scent of baking, Miss Marple found Bunch bustling about, setting out scones and a chipped teapot. The vicar, Julian, joined them, his mild face creased with concern. "It's shaken the village," he said. "Letitia's holding up, but Dora's a wreck." Bunch, pouring tea, added, "Mrs. Swettenham says Rudy was after Letitia's money, but I don't see it. He was just a hotel boy." Miss Marple, sipping her tea, listened as village gossip unfolded. Colonel Easterbrook suspected a local grudge, while Miss Hinchcliffe muttered about shady types at the hotel. Amy Murgatroyd, Bunch confided, was convinced she'd heard two voices in the dark, though no one took her seriously. Miss Marple's questions were gentle but pointed. "This Randall Godler, his fortune is significant?" Bunch nodded. "Oh, yes. Letitia worked for him years ago, and he left her everything, provided Sonia dies first. Sonia's ill, they say, so it won't be long." Julian, stirring his tea, mentioned a secondary heir. "A child, I believe, from one of Randall's cousins." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her expression remained mild. She asked about Letitia's past, learning of her sister Charlotte, who had died abroad of a thyroid condition. "Poor thing," Bunch said. "She was shy, always ill. Letitia never speaks of her." As tea ended, Miss Marple strolled to the village green, her black umbrella tapping the pavement. Chipping Cleghorn was picture-perfect. Cottages with thatched roofs, a duck pond, a church spire piercing the sky. But she knew villages hid secrets as deftly as cities. At the Bluebird Café, she paused, overhearing Mrs. Swettenham and Laura Easterbrook discussing the shooting. "Letitia's so calm," Laura said, her voice low, almost too calm. Mrs. Swettenham, eager for drama, whispered, "What if Rudy was blackmailing her? He knew something, mark my words." Miss Marple, pretending to study the menu, filed the remark away. Blackmail, she thought, was a motive as old as sin. Back at Milchester, Craddock pursued his own leads. A constable had interviewed the hotel manager, who confirmed Rudy's light-fingered habits, but insisted he was no killer. More intriguing was a report from a cafe owner in Meddenham Wells, who'd seen Rudy 2 days before the shooting, meeting a woman in a dark coat and scarf. The description, tall, dark-haired, elegant, matched Letitia, but her shopping trip placed her elsewhere. Craddock, sceptical of coincidences, sent Fletcher to canvass the cafe for witnesses. He also requested Rudy's bank records, suspecting a payoff for his role in the murder charade. At Little Paddocks, the household tried to resume normalcy, but tension simmered. Patrick, restless, paced the garden, his cigarette smoke curling into the air. Julia, reading in the drawing room, snapped at Dora when she fussed over a spilled teacup. "Really, Bunny, must you hover?" Dora, wounded, retreated to her room, where she sat writing a letter, her pen trembling. Philippa, returning from her job at a nearby nursery, noticed Mitzi muttering in the kitchen about shadows and lies. When Philippa offered a kind word, Mitzi flinched, as if expecting a blow. Craddock returned to Little Paddocks that afternoon, accompanied by the coroner's preliminary findings. Rudy's death was instantaneous. The bullet fired at close range, likely self-inflicted or by someone standing near him. The graze on Letitia's neck came from a separate shot, poorly aimed. Almost as if it was meant to miss. Craddock mused aloud, watching Letitia's reaction. She met his gaze evenly, but her fingers tightened on her chair. "I can't imagine why anyone would target me," she said. "I lead a quiet life." Craddock, unconvinced, asked about enemies or recent disputes. Letitia mentioned a minor row with a neighbour over a fence, but it seemed trivial. Dora, overhearing, blurted, "What about that letter, Letty? The one you burned last week?" Letitia's face hardened. "That was nothing, Bunny. A tradesman's bill." Craddock, sensing a thread, pressed Dora, but she backtracked, flustered. "Oh, I don't know. I get muddled." Patrick, intervening, steered the conversation to Rudy's criminal past, suggesting he'd acted alone. Julia, silent until now, added, "He probably thought he'd scare us and rob the place. Stupid boy." Her tone was dismissive, but Craddock caught a glance between her and Patrick, fleeting but charged. He made a mental note to dig into their backgrounds. Students, Letitia had said, but their Polish suggested more than modest means. As Craddock left, he passed Miss Marple on the lane, her black hat bobbing as she walked. She greeted him with a smile, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. "A dreadful business, Inspector," she said. "Have you considered the advertisement's purpose? It's so very public." Craddock, intrigued by her reputation for unravelling village mysteries, paused. "You think it was meant to draw a crowd?" Miss Marple's smile widened, or perhaps to distract from something else. "People see what they expect, don't they?" She wished him good day and continued on, her words lingering in Craddock's mind. That evening, Miss Marple dined at the vicarage, where Bunch shared the latest gossip. Edmund Swettenham had seen Patrick arguing with Rudy at the hotel a week earlier, though Patrick denied it. "Edmund's sweet on Philippa," Bunch said, "so he might be stirring trouble." Miss Marple, cutting her lamb, asked about Philippa's history. "A war widow," Julian replied. "Her husband left her with a little boy and no money. Letitia's been kind, letting her stay." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts circling the Godler will. A child as heir? A fortune in waiting? Motives, she knew, often hid in such details. At Little Paddocks, Letitia sat alone in the drawing room, the fire casting shadows on her face. She opened a locked drawer and withdrew a photograph, its edges worn. Two women, young and smiling, stared back, one with a scarf hiding her neck. Letitia's expression was unreadable as she slipped the photo into the flames, watching it curl and blacken. Outside, the wind stirred the trees, and Chipping Cleghorn settled into an uneasy night, its secrets buried but not forgotten. Chapter 4. The Shadow of the Past. The days following the shooting at Little Paddocks cast a long shadow over Chipping Cleghorn, where the village's usual rhythm of gossip and routine faltered under the weight of suspicion. The Gazette printed a restrained account of Whodunit's death, but whispers filled the gaps, weaving tales of robbery, revenge, and darker motives. At Little Paddocks, the household moved through its tasks with strained civility, each member watched by the others, as if expecting a hidden truth to surface. Miss Jane Marple, now a frequent visitor to the village, sensed the undercurrents of unease, her mild demeanour masking a mind that sifted through facts like a jeweller inspecting gems. On a crisp morning, Miss Marple arrived at Little Paddocks, her black umbrella tucked under her arm, ostensibly to return a borrowed gardening book. Letitia Blacklock, dressed in a tweed skirt and a silk blouse, greeted her with a warmth that seemed genuine, though her eyes held a guarded glint. The drawing-room, with its scent of beeswax and fading chrysanthemums, was quieter than before, the echoes of that fateful evening lingering in the scuffed floorboards and the bullet-scarred wall. Dora Bunner, darning socks by the window, looked up with a tremulous smile. "Oh, Miss Marple, how kind of you to call. It's been so dreadful, hasn't it?" Patrick Simmons, sprawled in an armchair with a newspaper, offered a lazy grin, while Julia, polishing her nails at a side table, barely acknowledged the guest. Philippa Hames was absent, working at the nursery, and Mitzi's clattering in the kitchen provided a distant backdrop. Miss Marple settled into a chintz-covered chair, her knitting bag at her feet. "Such a shock for you all," she said, her voice soft but probing. "I do hope you're managing, Miss Blacklock." Letitia, pouring tea from a silver pot, nodded. "We're trying. The police are thorough, but it's unsettling to have one's home turned into a crime scene." Her tone was light, but her hand shook slightly, spilling a drop of tea. Miss Marple, accepting a cup, steered the conversation to the past, a tactic she'd honed in countless village parlours. "You've lived here long, I understand. Did you grow up in these parts?" Letitia's smile tightened. "No, I was raised in London mostly. My brother Randall and I worked in finance there before the war. I came to Chipping Cleghorn for a quieter life." She paused, then added, "My sister, Charlotte, preferred the city, but she was never strong." Dora, dropping her darning, chimed in. "Poor Lottie, always so frail, with that dreadful goiter. She hated being seen, didn't she, Letty?" Letitia's expression softened, though her eyes flicked to Dora with a hint of warning. "Yes, she was shy. She passed away abroad during the war. A mercy, really, given her suffering." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her face a picture of sympathy. "How sad. Were you close?" Letitia hesitated, stirring her tea. "As sisters are. We had our own lives, but we wrote often." The answer was vague, and Miss Marple noted the absence of detail. She mentioned a cousin in her own village, prone to ailments. and soon Letitia was drawn into reminiscing about her youth. Balls in London, Randall's rise in finance, Charlotte's reclusive habits. A photograph on the mantel caught Miss Marple's eye. 2 young women, one with a scarf at her neck, the other with Letitia's sharp features. "Is that you and Charlotte?" she asked innocently. Letitia's hand froze mid-gesture. "Yes, an old picture. I keep it for sentiment." She rose abruptly, offering biscuits, and the moment passed. As they spoke, Patrick tossed aside his newspaper and joined the conversation, his charm resurfacing. "Aunt Lettie's the family rock," he said, winking. "Keeps us all in line, don't you?" Letitia's laugh was strained, and Julia, glancing up, muttered, "Some of us need more keeping than others." The sibling banter felt forced, and Miss Marple wondered about their history. Letitia had introduced them as cousins, students lodging with her, but their polished manners suggested a less provincial upbringing. Dora, eager to contribute, rambled about Randall's widow Sonia, and the fortune tied to Letitia's inheritance. "It's all so complicated, isn't it, Letty? Trusts and wills." Letitia's smile was thin. "Bunny, you do exaggerate. It's a simple matter, and hardly relevant now." Miss Marple, sipping her tea, filed away Dora's words. The Gödler fortune, she knew, was a thread worth pulling. She excused herself to admire the garden, where frost dusted the last roses. As she bent to inspect a shrub, she overheard Mitzi in the kitchen muttering to herself, "Lies, all lies! I know what I saw!" The housekeeper's voice, thick with fear, hinted at secrets unspoken. Miss Marple, straightening, made a mental note to speak with Mitzi alone. Suspecting her paranoia held a grain of truth. Meanwhile, in Milchester, Inspector Craddock pursued his investigation with dogged precision. His desk was strewn with reports. Rudy Scherz's bank account showed a recent deposit of £50, far more than his clerk's wages could explain. A witness from the Meddenham Wells Café, a sharp-eyed waitress named Elsie, had clarified her earlier statement. The woman meeting Rudy wasn't Letitia, but someone similar. Tall, dark-haired, with a scar on her neck, partially hidden by a scarf. Elsie, proud of her memory, added that the woman seemed agitated, glancing about as if fearing recognition. Craddock, intrigued, sent Sergeant Fletcher to recheck Letitia's alibi, though her Milchester receipts held firm. Craddock visited the Royal Spa Hotel, a faded grandame of a building, to interview Rudy's colleagues. The manager, a fussy man named Mr. Rowlandson, described Rudy as slippery but harmless, adept at charming guests but prone to bending rules. A chambermaid, Betty, recalled Rudy boasting about a big job days before his death, hinting at easy money. "He was cocky," Betty said, polishing a brass rail. "Said he'd be set for life soon." Craddock, jotting notes, suspected Rudy had been hired for the staged murder, perhaps as a distraction. But by whom? The advertisements. Boldness suggested a mind both cunning and reckless. Back in Chipping Cleghorn, Miss Marple called at the vicarage, where Bunch Harmon was wrestling with a jam-stained parish newsletter. Over tea and slightly burnt scones, Bunch shared the latest village talk. Miss Hinchcliffe, at the market, had speculated that Rudy was a pawn in a larger scheme, while Amy Murgatroyd fretted over the second voice she'd heard during the shooting. "Hinch thinks Amy's imagining things," Bunch said, "but Amy's stubborn about it." Miss Marple, nibbling a scone, asked about Patrick and Julia. Bunch shrugged. They're Letitia's cousins, or so she says. Bit glamorous for students, if you ask me. Edmund Swettenham swears he saw Patrick with Rudy at the hotel, arguing about money, but Patrick laughs it off. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to identity, a theme that nagged at her. She recalled a wartime case in her own village, where a woman had assumed her sister's name to escape a scandal. Could Letitia be hiding something similar? She wrote a letter to Dr. Thompson, a retired physician in Switzerland who'd known British expatriates during the war, asking discreetly about Charlotte Blacklock's death. It's probably nothing, she murmured, sealing the envelope. But her instincts told her otherwise. At Little Paddocks, the day unfolded with brittle normalcy. Patrick, bored, drove to Milchester to clear his head, though his frequent absences raised Julia's eyebrows. Julia, lounging in the drawing-room, rebuffed Dora's attempts at conversation, her sharp tongue cutting through Dora's nervous prattle. "Really, Bunny? Must you go on about Randall? It's ancient history." Dora, stung, retreated to the garden, where she dead-headed roses with trembling hands. Philippa, returning from work, found Mitzi in the pantry, scrubbing pots with furious energy. "They think I'm stupid," Mitzi hissed, "but I see things, shadows moving in the dark." Philippa, unsure how to respond, offered a sympathetic nod, sensing Mitzi's fear was rooted in something real. Craddock, returning to Little Paddocks, interviewed the household again, focusing on Rudy's possible connections. Letitia maintained she'd had no recent contact, though her composure wavered when Craddock mentioned the cafe sighting. "A woman with a scar," she said, touching her bandaged neck. "How odd. I've no such mark, except this graze." Her denial was plausible, but Craddock sensed evasion. Patrick, questioned about his alleged argument with Rudy, laughed. "Edmund's got it wrong. I barely knew the chap. Probably saw me haggling with a barman." Julia, cool as ever, claimed ignorance of Rudy's affairs, though her fingers drummed restlessly on the table. Dora, flustered under Craddock's scrutiny, let slip a curious detail. Letty got a letter last month from someone abroad. She didn't say who, but she was upset, weren't you, Letty? Letitia's face tightened. "Nonsense, Bunny. It was a condolence note from an old colleague. I wasn't upset." Craddock, sensing a lead, asked to see her correspondence, but Letitia claimed she burned all but essential letters. Dora's mouth opened, then closed, as if fearing she'd said too much. Philippa, when asked about strangers visiting the house, shook her head, her calm unshaken. Mitzi, however, insisted she'd seen a woman in a coat near the garden gate a week before the shooting, though her description was vague. Dark hair, tall, nothing more. As Craddock left, he met Miss Marple on the lane, her basket swinging lightly. She greeted him with a twinkle in her eye. "Any progress, Inspector? It's such a tangle, isn't it?" Craddock, warmed by her interest, shared a sanitized version of his findings, omitting the cafe sighting. Miss Marple, tilting her head, said, "I once knew a case where a man staged a robbery to cover a theft. The spectacle distracted everyone from the real crime." Craddock, struck by the idea, nodded thoughtfully. "You think the shooting was a diversion?" Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic. "Oh, I'm just an old woman guessing. But people do love a show, don't they?" That evening, Miss Marple dined with Colonel and Laura Easterbrook, who'd invited her to their neat bungalow. Over lamb, chops and minted peas. The Colonel speculated that Rudy was a foreign agent, a theory Laura dismissed with a laugh. "Really, Archie, you read too many thrillers." Miss Marple, steering talk to Letitia's past, learned the Blacklocks had been a prominent family, though Charlotte's illness had kept her from society. Letitia was the strong one, Laura said, always managing things. The Colonel, pouring wine, added, Randall Godler was a genius, but ruthless. Left Letitia a fortune, I hear, if Sonia goes first. Miss Marple, nodding, tucked the detail away, her thoughts circling sisters' scars and secrets. At Little Paddocks, Letitia sat by the fire, a book unopened in her lap. The house was quiet, save for the creak of floorboards, as Patrick returned late, his footsteps heavy. In her room, Dora stared at a locked diary, her face pale. Julia, passing by, knocked sharply. "Bunny, stop moping. It's tiresome." Downstairs, Philippa wrote a letter to her son, her pen steady despite the weight of the day. Mitzi, in the kitchen, locked the back door with a trembling hand, muttering prayers in her native tongue. Outside, the village slept, but the past, like a restless ghost, stirred in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered. Chapter 5. A Second Death. The quiet of Chipping Cleghorn, already bruised by the shooting at Little Paddocks, shattered anew on a damp Tuesday morning. A fine drizzle cloaked the village, softening the outlines of thatched cottages and the church spire, but it could not wash away the growing sense of dread. At Little Paddocks, the household moved through its routines with a forced normalcy, the weight of Inspector Craddock's ongoing inquiries pressing on every conversation. Miss Jane Marple, now a familiar figure in the village, sensed a tightening coil of tension, her sharp eyes missing nothing as she knitted and listened, piecing together fragments of motive and opportunity. In the village's heart, the Bluebird cafe bustled with mid-morning trade, its steamed-up windows a haven for gossip. Dora Bunner, Letitia Blacklock's fluttery companion, had ventured out to buy thread and escaped the stifling atmosphere of Little Paddocks. She sat at a corner table, her faded blue coat draped over the chair, her hands fidgeting with a cup of tea. The cafe's owner, Mrs. Lucas, a stout woman with a keen ear for scandal, hovered nearby, wiping tables with unnecessary vigour. "Terrible business at Little Paddocks, Miss Bunner," she said, fishing for details. Dora, eager for sympathy, nodded. "Oh, dreadful! Poor Letty, grazed by a bullet and that boy dead on our floor." Her voice trembled, drawing glances from other patrons, a farmer in muddy boots, a pair of spinsters sharing a scone. Dora sipped her tea, her thoughts scattered. She'd been troubled since Craddock's last visit, his questions about letters and Letitia's past stirring memories. She couldn't quite grasp. Lottie and Letty, she murmured to herself, unaware she'd spoken aloud. Mrs. Lucas, catching the words, leaned closer. "What's that, dear? Talking about Miss Blacklock?" Dora started, her cup clattering. "Oh, nothing. Just wool gathering. I must get back." She fumbled for coins, her face flushed and rose, pulling on her coat. As she stepped toward the door, her knees buckled and she collapsed with a soft cry, her body crumpling to the linoleum floor. The cafe erupted in chaos. The farmer leapt to his feet, knocking over a chair, while the spinsters gasped, clutching their napkins. Mrs. Lucas, with surprising agility, knelt beside Dora, loosening her scarf. "Fetch Dr. Harris," she shouted to a waitress, who bolted out the door. Dora's face was ashen, her lips tinged blue, her breath coming in shallow gasps. A faint, bitter smell clung to her lips, unnoticed in the panic. By the time Dr. Harris, a brisk man with a battered medical bag, arrived, Dora's eyes had glazed over, her body still. He checked her pulse, his expression grim. "She's gone?" he said, his voice low. "I'll need to inform the police." Word of Dora's death spread like wildfire, reaching Little Paddocks by noon. Letitia, in the morning room sorting bills, froze when Bunch Harmon, the vicar's wife, arrived with the news, her round face pale. "Letty, I'm so sorry. Dora, at the cafe, she just collapsed." Letitia's hand flew to her throat, where the bandage from her graze was freshly changed. "Collapsed? But she was fine this morning." Her voice cracked, and for a moment her composure slipped, revealing raw grief. Patrick, entering with a stack of books, stopped short. "Bunny? Dead?" His shock seemed genuine, though his eyes darted to Letitia, as if gauging her reaction. Julia, trailing behind, lit a cigarette, her face impassive. "Poor old thing," she said, exhaling smoke. "She was always so nervy." Philippa Hames, pruning shrubs in the garden, learned of Dora's death from Mitzi, who burst out the back door, her apron twisted in her hands. "Miss Bunner, she is dead! Poison, they say! We are all cursed!" Mitzi's hysteria was infectious, and Philippa, usually composed, felt a chill. "Poison? That's nonsense, Mitzi. It must be her heart." But Mitzi shook her head, muttering about evil in this house. Philippa, brushing dirt from her hands, returned to the house, her thoughts troubled. Dora's death, so soon after Rudy's, felt like a pattern, though she couldn't name it. Inspector Craddock arrived at the cafe within the hour, his lean frame taut with purpose. The coroner's initial examination, conducted in a back room, confirmed cyanide in Dora's tea, its bitter almond scent unmistakable to the trained nose. Craddock, his grey eyes narrowing, questioned Mrs. Lucas, who recounted Dora's brief visit. She was jumpy, talking to herself about Lottie and Letty. Mrs. Lucas said, relishing her role as witness. Then she keeled over, just like that. The waitress, a shy girl named Peggy, added that Dora had met a woman earlier, described as tall, elegant, with a scarf hiding a scar on her neck. "She ordered tea for them both," Peggy said, "but left before Miss Bunner drank hers." Craddock, struck by the description's similarity to the woman seen with Rudy, felt a prickle of suspicion. At Little Paddocks, Craddock gathered the household in the drawing-room, where the fire burned low, casting flickering shadows. Letitia, her face drawn, sat rigid, her hands clasped. Patrick paced, his usual charm replaced by agitation, while Julia, lounging on a sofa, flicked ash into a saucer. Philippa, her knitting untouched, watched silently, and Mitzi, summoned from the kitchen, hovered by the door, her eyes wide with fear. Craddock, his tone measured, announced Dora's death by cyanide poisoning. "I need to know your movements this morning," he said. "Miss Bunner was targeted, and the killer is likely someone close." Letitia, her voice steady despite her pallor, said she'd been at home, writing letters. Dora went to the village around 10. She said she needed thread. Patrick, lighting a cigarette, claimed he'd been in Milchester, browsing bookshops, an alibi Craddock noted for verification. Julia, with a bored sigh, said she'd slept late, then read in her room. Philippa, her voice soft, admitted to gardening, until noon, alone. Mitzi, trembling, insisted she'd been in the kitchen, preparing lunch. "I touched no tea, I swear." Her vehemence drew a sharp glance from Julia, who muttered, "Nobody's accusing you, Mitzi." Craddock probed further, asking about Dora's state of mind. Letitia described her as unsettled since the shooting, prone to rambling about the past. She was fond of reminiscing, Letitia said, but it was harmless. Patrick, interrupting, said, "Bunny was always muddled, kept calling Aunt Letty Lottie, like they were girls again." Craddock's interest sharpened. "Lottie? Was that a nickname for Miss Blacklock?" Letitia's smile was tight. "Sometimes, yes. Dora mixed things up." Her answer was smooth, but Craddock caught a flicker of unease in her eyes. The inspector turned to the cafe meeting, describing the woman with the scarf. Letitia touched her bandaged neck, her expression puzzled. "A scar? I've only this graze, and I was here all morning." Her alibi, supported by a delivery boy who'd seen her at 11, seemed solid, but Craddock remained sceptical. He asked about enemies or recent disputes, but Letitia shook her head. Dora was harmless. Who'd want her dead? Philippa, speaking for the first time, said quietly, "She was kind, but she talked too much. Perhaps someone didn't like that." Her words hung in the air, and Craddock noted the tension in the room. Patrick's clenched jaw, Julia's sudden stillness, Mitzi's stifled gasp. Miss Marple, meanwhile, visited the Bluebird Café, her curiosity piqued by Bunch Harmon's breathless account of Dora's death. Seated at a table near Dora's last, she ordered tea and engaged Mrs. Lucas in conversation. "Such a tragedy," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle. "Did Miss Bunner seem herself?" Mrs. Lucas, eager to talk, described Dora's agitation and her muttering about Lottie and Letty. "Sounded like she was fretting over something old," Mrs. Lucas said. Peggy, clearing plates, added that the woman with the scarf had paid for the tea in cash, leaving no name. Miss Marple, stirring, her tea recalled a case in St. Mary Mead where poison silenced a witness. "People talk," she murmured, "and some listen too closely." At the Milchester police station, Craddock reviewed the evidence. The cyanide, a fast-acting poison, suggested premeditation, and the cafe setting pointed to someone familiar with Dora's habits. He dispatched Sergeant Fletcher to trace the woman with the scarf, though the description was maddeningly vague. Tall, dark-haired, elegant, like half the women in the county. Rudy's bank deposit, now traced to an unlisted source, hinted at a payoff. And Craddock wondered if Dora's death was tied to the same scheme. He requested a background check on Patrick and Julia, whose student status felt increasingly flimsy, and sent a constable to verify Letitia's delivery boy alibi. In Chipping Cleghorn, the village buzzed with theories. At the post office, Miss Hartnell declared Dora's death a gangland plot, while Colonel Easterbrook, buying tobacco, suggested a personal vendetta. Miss Hinchcliffe, delivering eggs to the vicarage, scoffed at both ideas. "Someone's tying up loose ends," she said to Amy Murgatroyd, who shivered. "Hinch, don't say that. It's too horrible." Edmund Swettenham, lingering at the Bluebird Cafe, overheard Peggy's description of the scarred woman and mentioned it to Philippa, with whom he'd struck up a shy friendship. "Sounds like Miss Blacklock, but it can't be," he said. Philippa, her face unreadable, said, "People see what they want to see." Miss Marple, returning to Meddenham Wells, received a reply from Dr. Thompson in Switzerland. His letter, written in a spidery hand, noted that Charlotte Blacklock's death in 1942 was recorded as heart failure, but the clinic's records were incomplete, a common issue during the war. "Oddly," he wrote, "her doctor mentioned a thyroid condition, not cardiac issues." Miss Marple, folding the letter, felt a spark of certainty. Charlotte's death, she suspected, was a cornerstone of the mystery, though its shape remained elusive. She resolved to visit Little Paddocks again, hoping to coax more from Letitia or Mitzi. At Little Paddocks, grief and fear frayed the household's edges. Letitia, sorting Dora's belongings, found a diary filled with cryptic notes. Lottie's secret, the letter from abroad, but locked it away, her face pale. Patrick, returning from Milchester, snapped at Julia when she questioned his absence. "Mind your own business," he said, slamming his door. Julia, undeterred, slipped into the garden, where she smoked in silence, her eyes scanning the house. Philippa, writing to her son, paused, sensing the weight of unspoken truths. Mitzi, scrubbing the kitchen floor, whispered prayers, her fear of shadows growing with each passing day. Craddock, dining at the Milchester Arms, mulled over the case. Dora's death, he realized, shifted the narrative. Rudy's shooting could be a botched stunt, but poison was deliberate, intimate. He recalled Miss Marple's suggestion of a diversion, and wondered if Dora, with her muddled memories, had stumbled onto a secret worth killing for. As he finished his pint, a constable delivered news. The delivery boy's statement was shaky. He'd seen a woman at Little Paddocks, but couldn't swear it was Letitia. Craddock, his pulse quickening, resolved to confront Letitia again, sensing the threads of the case tightening. In the vicarage, Miss Marple joined Bunch and Julian for supper, the table laden with shepherd's pie and apple tart. Bunch, slicing bread, shared the latest gossip. Mrs. Swettenham claimed Letitia had burned a mysterious letter, while Laura Easterbrook hinted at a romantic scandal in Letitia's past. "Laura's fanciful," Julian said, "but the village loves a story." Miss Marple, spooning tart, asked about Dora's habits. "She was always at the cafe," Bunch said. "Loved her tea and a chat." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts on poison and opportunity. "A chat," she said softly, "can be dangerous, can't it?" As night fell, Chipping Cleghorn grew still, the drizzle turning to rain. At Little Paddocks, Letitia stood by the drawing-room window, her reflection ghostly in the glass. A photograph, hidden in her desk, burned in her mind. 2 sisters, one scarred, one strong. In the kitchen, Mitzi locked the doors, her hands trembling. Upstairs, Dora's room stood empty, its silence a reminder that death, once announced, had returned unbidden, and the village waited breathless for what might come next. Chapter 6. The Village Whispers. The rain that had cloaked Chipping Cleghorn for days gave way to a brittle autumn sun, casting long shadows across the village green. Yet the brightness did little to lift the pall of suspicion that hung over the community. Dora Bunner's sudden death, following so closely on the heels of Rudy Scherz's shooting, had transformed Little Paddocks from a place of curiosity into one of dread. The villagers, accustomed to the gentle ebb of daily life, now spoke in hushed tones, their glances darting toward the Georgian house at the lane's end. Miss Jane Marple, her black hat bobbing as she walked the village paths, sensed the currents of fear and speculation, her mind sifting through the tangle of clues with the patience of a gardener tending a knotty vine. At the Milchester Police Station, Inspector Dermot Craddock sat hunched over a desk littered with reports. His sharp grey eyes narrowed in concentration. The coroner's final report confirmed cyanide in Dora's tea, administered in a public setting that suggested both audacity and precision. The woman with the scarf, seen with Dora at the Bluebird Café, remained elusive. Her description: tall, dark-haired, elegant, too vague to pin down. Craddock's inquiries into Rudy's £50 deposit had hit a dead end. The cash was untraceable, likely handed over in person. Frustration gnawed at him, but he clung to a growing certainty. The advertised murder was a staged spectacle, and Dora's poisoning a desperate act to silence her. The question was, silence her about what? In Chipping Cleghorn, the village hummed with theories, each more fanciful than the last. At the post office, Miss Hartnell, her voice sharp as a tack, declared the deaths the work of a maniac on the loose, while Mrs. Swettenham, buying stamps, countered with a tale of foreign spies inspired by a radio serial. The Bluebird, café now a grim landmark, drew curious patrons who lingered over tea, hoping for a glimpse of the fatal table. Mrs. Lucas, the owner, obliged with dramatic retellings, embellishing Dora's last moments with a flourish that would have made the poor woman blush. She was muttering about Lottie, Mrs. Lucas told a rapt audience, as if she knew something dreadful. Miss Hinchcliffe and Amy Murgatroyd, tending their vegetable patch, discussed the case with their usual bluntness. Miss Hinchcliffe, her hands caked with soil, jabbed a trowel into the earth. "It's no coincidence, Amy. Someone in that house is pulling strings, and Dora got too close." Amy, weeding nervously, nodded. "I keep thinking about that night, Hinch. The voice. It wasn't Rudy's, and I swear I saw two shadows by the door. Not one." Miss Hinchcliffe grunted, sceptical but troubled. "You and your shadows. Still, something's rotten at Little Paddocks, and it's not just Mitzi's cooking." Edmund Swettenham, meanwhile, lingered at the village shop, his poet's eyes, dreamy but sharp. He'd taken to watching Philippa Hames, whose quiet strength drew him like a moth to a flame. Over a cup of weak coffee, he shared his thoughts with her, his voice low. "The whole village is talking, Philippa. They say Dora knew something about Letitia, something worth killing for." Philippa, arranging apples in a crate, paused, her pale hands steady. "Dora was kind, but she rambled. People hear what they want in ramblings." Her tone was neutral, but Edmund caught a flicker of unease in her eyes. "You're worried, aren't you?" he pressed. Philippa's smile was faint. "Aren't we all?" At Little Paddocks, the household was a study in strained silences. Letitia Blacklock, her neck now free of bandages, moved through the day with a brittle poise, her dark eyes scanning the faces around her. Patrick Simmons, restless as ever, spent hours tinkering with a motorbike in the garage, his laughter rarer since Dora's death. Julia, her elegance undimmed, read French novels in the drawing room, her cigarette smoke curling like a question mark. Philippa, when not at the nursery, kept to herself, her knitting a shield against the house's tension. Mitzi, her paranoia, flaring scrubbed pots with a vengeance, muttering about eyes in the dark, and refusing to leave the kitchen after dusk. Craddock, determined to shake loose new leads, revisited the revolver from the shooting. Forensic tests showed it had been wiped clean before Rudy's death, leaving no fingerprints, not even his own. Odd, Craddock mused to Sergeant Fletcher, a stolid man polishing his boots in the station's corner. If Rudy fired it, his prints should be there. Someone handled it after. Fletcher nodded, suggesting a second person in the room, a theory bolstered by Amy Murgatroyd's claim of a deeper voice. Craddock, recalling Miss Marple's hint about diversions, wondered if the shooting was a theatrical flourish to mask a subtler crime. He sent Fletcher to re-interview the hotel staff, hoping for a clue to Rudy's big job. Miss Marple, meanwhile, called at the vicarage, where Bunch Harmon was wrestling with a typewriter, drafting a parish bulletin. The cosy room, with its sagging bookshelves and scent of lavender, was a balm to Miss Marple's nerves, though her mind remained on the case. Over tea and ginger biscuits, Bunch shared the latest gossip. Mrs. Swettenham says Letitia's hiding. A scandal. Something about her time in London, Bunch said, her eyes wide. And Laura Easterbrook thinks Patrick's too charming, like he's playing a part. The vicar, Julian, polishing his glasses, cautioned against rumour. Letitia's a good woman, he said. This talk is unfair. Miss Marple, nibbling a biscuit, asked about Dora's last days. She was jumpy, Bunch admitted. Kept saying Lottie and Letty like they were different people. Silly, really. The mention of names pricked Miss Marple's interest. She recalled Dr. Thompson's letter, with its vague account of Charlotte Blacklock's death, and wondered if Dora's confusion held a key. Names can be slippery, she said, her voice mild. In my village, we had a woman who used her sister's name to dodge a debt. Caused no end of trouble. Bunch laughed, but Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere, circling the idea of identity. She resolved to examine the photograph at Little Paddocks more closely, sensing it hid more than sentimental value. Craddock, pursuing the Godler will, contacted a solicitor in London who'd handled Randall Godler's estate. The solicitor, a dry man named Mr. Weatherby, confirmed that Letitia would inherit a vast fortune upon Sonia Godler's death, expected soon due to Sonia's terminal illness. A secondary heir, the young son of a distant cousin, would benefit if Letitia predeceased Sonia. The boy's mother is a widow, Weatherby said over the phone, living quietly, I believe. Craddock, suspecting Philippa Hames, requested. Her background, learning she was indeed the cousin's widow. Her son Pip, the potential heir. The motive was tantalizing. But Philippa's calm demeanour and modest life seemed at odds with murder. In the village, Miss Marple lunched at Colonel Easterbrook's bungalow. A neat affair with military prints and a ticking grandfather clock. Laura Easterbrook, her blonde hair swept into a chignon, served cold chicken and salad, her chatter light but strained. The Colonel, pouring sherry, speculated about wartime forgeries, a topic Miss Marple encouraged. "Oh, yes," she said. "We had a case in St. Mary Mead where a woman swapped identities to escape a marriage. Passports were so easy to fake then." The Colonel nodded, recalling tales of black market papers. "Could happen here," he said. "Someone posing as another, eh?" Laura, refilling glasses, laughed nervously. "Really, Archie, you make it sound like a spy novel." Miss Marple, cutting her chicken, steered talk to Rudy's role. "I wonder if he was hired for a performance," she said, "only to become a victim." The Colonel frowned, intrigued, while Laura shivered. "It's too horrible," she said. "Poor Dora, too. She must have known something." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. Or said something, perhaps, that someone feared. As she left, she noted Laura's unease, wondering if it stemmed from gossip or something closer to home. At Little Paddocks, Craddock arrived for another round of interviews, his questions sharper now. Letitia, serving coffee in the morning room, maintained her composure, denying any knowledge of Dora's cafe companion. "I was here all morning," she said, gesturing to a pile of correspondence. "Ask the postman." Craddock, unconvinced, asked about Dora's ramblings. "She was fond of old memories," Letitia said, "but nothing significant." Patrick, lounging nearby, scoffed. Bunny lived in the past. All that Lottie nonsense made no sense. Julia, entering with a magazine, added, "She was Dotty, Inspector. Probably imagined half of it." Philippa, questioned alone, admitted Dora had seemed distracted, once mentioning a secret about Letitia's youth. "She didn't explain," Philippa said, her voice soft. "I thought it was just talk." Mitzi, trembling in the kitchen, repeated her tale of a woman by the garden gate, adding a new detail. "She had a limp, I think, but it was dark." Craddock, sceptical of Mitzi's theatrics, nonetheless noted the limp, wondering if it was a fabrication or a clue. He left with a sense of circling closer to the truth, though it remained just out of reach. Miss Marple, visiting Little Paddocks, found Letitia in the garden, clipping lavender. The photograph was absent from the mantel, and Letitia's explanation, "I'm tidying old things," felt rehearsed. Miss Marple, undeterred, chatted about village life, slipping in a question about Charlotte. Did she ever visit Chipping Cleghorn? Letitia's scissors paused. No, she was too ill. Always abroad, poor thing. Her voice was steady. But Miss Marple caught a fleeting shadow in her expression, as if memory were a dangerous place. That evening, the village gathered for a church social, a subdued affair with tea-urns and trestle tables. Miss Hinchcliffe cornered Craddock, her voice low. "You're looking in the wrong place, Inspector. It's the household. Too many secrets under that roof." Amy, clutching a plate of sandwiches, nodded. "I told Hinch I saw 2 shadows that night. Nobody listens." Craddock, intrigued, promised to follow up, though Amy's vagueness frustrated him. Edmund, hovering near Philippa, whispered, "Be careful, Philippa. This isn't over." Philippa's smile was strained. "I'm just a lodger, Edmund. What have I to fear?" At the vicarage, Miss Marple dined with Bunch and Julian, the table laden with roast pork and apple sauce. Bunch, carving, shared a tidbit. Mitzi had told the butcher she'd seen a ghost in the garden, a woman in a scarf. "She's terrified," Bunch said. "Says she'll leave if it happens again." Miss Marple, spooning gravy, recalled a case where a servant's fear unmasked a killer. "Servants see things," she said, "because nobody watches them." Julian, slicing pork, frowned. "You think Mitzi knows something?" Miss Marple's smile was serene. "Oh, I think many know something, but not what it means." As night fell, Little Paddocks stood silent, its windows dark. Letitia, in her study, locked a drawer containing Dora's diary, her face unreadable. Patrick, in the garage, polished his motorbike, his jaw tight. Julia, by her window, watched, the moon, her cigarette glowing. Philippa, writing to her son, paused, her pen hovering. Mitzi, in her attic room, prayed, a knife under her pillow. Outside the village slept, but its whispers like the wind carried secrets that refused to stay buried. Chapter 7. The Masquerade. Unravels. The autumn chill deepened in Chipping Cleghorn. The village's hedgerows dusted with frost under a sky of unrelenting grey. The deaths of Rudy Sherds and Dora Bunner had woven a net of suspicion, ensnaring little Paddocks in a web of half-truths and watchful eyes. The villagers, once content with petty gossip, now spoke of murder with a mix of fear and fascination, their theories swirling like leaves in the wind. Miss Jane Marple, her black shawl draped over her shoulders, moved through the village with quiet purpose, her mind piecing together the puzzle's jagged edges. At Little Paddocks, the household teetered on the edge of revelation, each member guarding secrets that threatened to spill. Inspector Dermot Craddock, his lean frame hunched over a desk in the Milchester police station, felt the case's weight pressing harder. The cyanide in Dora's tea pointed to a killer with intimate knowledge of the household, while Rudy's wiped revolver suggested a calculated act, not a robbery gone wrong. A new lead had emerged. A jeweller in Meddenham Wells reported Rudy pawning a woman's brooch engraved with the initials CB, days before his death. The brooch, a delicate piece with emeralds, was unfamiliar to Letitia when Craddock showed her a sketch. But her quick dismissal, "I've never seen it," rang hollow. Craddock, his grey eyes sharp, suspected the brooch tied Rudy to someone in Little Paddocks, perhaps the woman with the scarf. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat in the vicarage parlour, her knitting needles clicking as she listened to Bunch Harmon recount the latest village talk. The room, with its worn rugs and scent of beeswax, was a haven from the chill outside. Bunch, stirring a pot of tea, described a heated exchange at the market. Miss Hinchcliffe had accused Patrick Simmons of dodgy dealings after hearing he'd been seen near Rudy's hotel room. "Hinch is like a terrier," Bunch said, "but Amy swears she saw Patrick there too." Julian Harmon, leafing through a sermon, frowned. "Gossip's a dangerous thing, Bunch. We mustn't judge." Miss Marple, her eyes twinkling, agreed, but her thoughts were on Patrick's evasions and the brooch's initials. "CB," she murmured, testing the letters against Charlotte Blacklock's name. Her suspicions had crystallized after studying old photographs at the Chipping Cleghorn Library, where a dusty album of local families included a faded image of the Blacklock sisters. Letitia, tall and poised, stood beside Charlotte, whose scarf hid her neck. A faint scar, barely visible, peeked from the scarf's edge, matching descriptions of the woman seen with Rudy and Dora. Miss Marple's letter from Dr. Thompson, with its ambiguous account of Charlotte's death, had planted a seed. What if Charlotte hadn't died. What if the woman calling herself Letitia was an impostor, hiding behind her sister's name? The idea, bold yet plausible, drove Miss Marple to act. She visited Little Paddocks under the pretense of borrowing a recipe, her black bag swinging lightly. Letitia, in a wool dress, welcomed her into the morning room, where a fire crackled against the damp. The photograph was back on the mantel, its frame polished, but Miss Marple noted a new stiffness in Letitia's posture. Patrick was absent, tinkering in Milchester, while Julia read in the library, her cigarette smoke drifting through the hall. Philippa Hames, sorting laundry, offered a quiet nod, and Mitzi, peeling potatoes, muttered about ghosts in the larder. Dora's absence hung heavy, her empty chair a silent accusation. Miss Marple, sipping tea, steered talk to family ties. "You must miss your sister, Miss Blacklock," she said, her voice soft. "Sisters are such a comfort." Letitia's smile was strained. Charlotte was frail, always in pain. Her death was a release. Her words were measured, but Miss Marple caught a tremor in her hand, clutching the teacup. She pressed gently, mentioning a cousin in St. Mary Mead who'd swapped names for a legacy. "Such confusion it caused," she said, watching Letitia's face. A shadow crossed it, quickly masked. "People do strange things," Letitia said, rising to adjust the curtains. "More tea?" The conversation shifted, but Miss Marple's mind raced. She excused herself to the garden, where frost glittered on the lavender. As she bent to inspect a rose, she overheard Mitzi in the kitchen, whispering to Philippa, "She lies, that one. I saw her burn papers late at night." Philippa's reply was inaudible, but her tone was sharp. Miss Marple, straightening, resolved to confront Letitia alone, sensing the masquerade was nearing its end. Craddock, pursuing the Gödler will, received a cable from Sonia Gödler's physician in Switzerland. Sonia was days from death, her heart failing. Letitia's inheritance, millions in bonds and property, was imminent. But if Letitia were an impostor, the fortune's rightful heir was in question. Craddock, cross-referencing Philippa's background, confirmed her son, Pip, was the secondary heir, a fact she'd never mentioned. Her reticence intrigued him, though her modest life, a widow scraping by, seemed free of guile. He sent Sergeant Fletcher to London to dig into Patrick and Julia's past, suspecting their student status was a cover. In the village, whispers grew louder. At the Bluebird Café, Laura Easterbrook, her blonde hair tucked under a chic hat, told Mrs. Swettenham that Letitia had received a strange call from abroad, overheard by the postmistress. "She sounded rattled," Laura said, stirring her coffee. Mrs. Swettenham, her eyes gleaming, suggested blackmail. "Someone knows something, Laura. Mark my words!" Across the green, Colonel Easterbrook, polishing his car, shared a theory with Edmund Swettenham. That Rudy chap was hired to scare Letitia, but someone turned the tables. Edmund, smitten with Philippa, nodded absently, his thoughts on her quiet strength. Miss Marple, dining at Miss Hinchcliffe's cottage, probed the shooting night's details. The cottage, cluttered with gardening tools and dog-eared books, smelled of earth and stew. Miss Hinchcliffe, carving mutton, was blunt. "It's a conspiracy, Miss Marple. That household's hiding something, and Dora paid the price." Amy, Murgatroyd, slicing bread, trembled. "I told Hinch. I saw 2 figures that night, one by the door, one further back. Nobody believes me." Miss Marple, her eyes kind, encouraged her. "Details matter, dear. What did the second figure do?" Amy faltered. "Just stood there, I think, holding something, maybe a torch." The image, vague but vivid, strengthened Miss Marple's theory of a staged act gone wrong. Craddock, revisiting Little Paddocks, confronted Letitia about the brooch. "CB could stand for Charlotte Blacklock," he said, watching her closely. Letitia's face paled, but she laughed. Charlotte had no such jewellery. She was too ill for finery. Her denial was smooth, but Craddock noted her fingers twisting a handkerchief. He asked about Dora's diary, mentioned by Philippa as full of odd notes. Letitia claimed it was lost, her voice sharp. "Dora was fanciful, Inspector. She wrote nonsense." Craddock, unconvinced, requested a search, which Letitia reluctantly allowed. The diary, found in Dora's bureau, contained cryptic entries. "Lottie's not herself, the scar tells. Why the lie?" Craddock, pocketing, it felt the case's heart beating closer. Miss Marple, returning to Meddenham Wells, received a second letter from Dr. Thompson. Charlotte's death certificate, he wrote, was signed by a doctor later discredited for forging records during the war. "It's possible," he added, "that her death was staged, though I've no proof." Miss Marple, folding the letter, felt a surge of clarity. She returned to Little Paddocks, asking Letitia to walk with her in the garden, away from prying ears. The air was sharp, the grass crunching underfoot. Miss Marple, her voice gentle but firm, said, "I've seen the photographs, Miss Blacklock. The scar on your neck. It's older than the Greys, isn't it? Charlotte's scar." Letitia stopped, her breath catching. For a moment she seemed poised to flee, but Miss Marple's steady gaze held her. "You're not Letitia," Miss Marple continued. "You're Charlotte, aren't you? Letitia died abroad, and you took her place." Letitia or Charlotte swayed, her face crumpling. "How did you know?" she whispered, sinking onto a bench. In halting words, she confessed. Charlotte, disfigured by a goiter and shunned by society, had nursed Letitia through a fever in Switzerland. When Letitia died, Charlotte, desperate for a new life, assumed her identity, forging papers with a doctor's help. "I wanted to live," she said, tears falling, "not hide forever." The murder announcement, Charlotte admitted, was her idea, a staged attempt on her life to deflect suspicion from her secret. Rudy, hired through a discreet contact, was to fire blanks and flee, but an accomplice, panicking, shot him dead. Dora, who'd known Charlotte as a girl, began to suspect the truth, her ramblings about Lottie growing reckless. "I didn't kill her," Charlotte said, her voice breaking. "But someone did, to protect me." Miss Marple, her heart heavy, asked, "Who helped you, Charlotte? Who fired the shot?" Charlotte's lips trembled, but she shook her head. "I can't say. They'd kill me too." Miss Marple, sensing her fear, didn't press, but her mind raced. Patrick and Julia, with their polished charm and vague pasts, were likely candidates. Their loyalty to Charlotte rooted in greed for the Godler fortune. She urged Charlotte to tell Craddock, but Charlotte refused, her eyes wild. "I'll lose everything, my life, my home." Miss Marple, patting her hand, said, "The truth, my dear, is the only way out. Craddock, unaware of the confession, interviewed Patrick and Julia, his suspicions honed by Fletcher's London findings. The siblings were not students but drifters with a history of minor scams. Their cousin, status a lie. Patrick, cornered, admitted knowing Rudy casually, claiming it was just pub talk. Julia, icier, denied any involvement, her fingers drumming. "You're fishing, Inspector," she said. "We're here for Aunt Letty, nothing more." Craddock, holding the diary, read aloud Dora's note. "The scar tells." Julia's face remained blank, but Patrick's jaw tightened, a tell Craddock noted. In the village, the church bell tolled for Dora's memorial, a sombre affair attended by all. Letitia, Charlotte, stood rigid, her scarf high, while Patrick and Julia flanked her, their faces masks of grief. Philippa, with Edmund at her side, wept quietly, her thoughts on her son's future. Mitzi, in the back pew, clutched a rosary, her fear palpable. Miss Hinchcliffe, nudging Amy, whispered, "Look at them. Guilty as sin, some of them." Amy, clutching her hymn book, nodded, her memory of two shadows unshaken. Miss Marple, at the vicarage, shared her findings with Craddock, her voice low over a cup of cocoa. "Charlotte Blacklock is alive, Inspector, and living as Letitia. The shooting was her scheme, but it spiralled out of control." Craddock, stunned, listened as she outlined the motive. The Godler fortune, secured by a false identity, threatened by Dora's loose tongue. "Someone in that house," Miss Marple said, "is her accomplice, and they're dangerous." Craddock, his mind racing, planned a trap, sensing the case's climax was near. He thanked Miss Marple, her insight a beacon in the fog. At Little Paddocks, Charlotte sat by the fire, her hands trembling. A letter slipped under her door read, "Tell the truth, or you're next." She burned it, her face pale, as the house creaked around her. Patrick in the hall polished his shoes, whistling tunelessly. Julia, by her window, watched the stars, her cigarette unlit. Philippa, reading to her son by letter, paused, sensing danger. Mitzi, locking the kitchen, prayed louder, her knife closer. Outside, the village held its breath, the masquerade unravelling under the weight of truth. Chapter 8. The Accomplices. The frost that gripped Chipping Cleghorn had tightened its hold, glazing the village's lanes with a brittle sheen that mirrored the tension at Little Paddocks. The revelations of Charlotte Blacklock's true identity, confessed to Miss Jane Marple in the frost-bitten garden, had set the stage for a reckoning. The deaths of Rudy Shirts and Dora Bunner, once disjointed tragedies, now formed a grim pattern, woven by greed and deception. The village, its gossip now tempered by fear, watched the Georgian house with bated breath, sensing the unravelling of secrets long buried. Miss Marple, her black shawl drawn tight, moved with quiet resolve, her mind a crucible where facts and intuition fused into clarity. At the Milchester police station, Inspector Dermot Craddock pored over the case's threads, his desk a chaos of notes and coffee stains. Charlotte's confession, relayed by Miss Marple in a discreet meeting at the vicarage, had shifted his perspective. The staged murder announcement, meant to cement Charlotte's false identity as Letitia, had spiralled into real bloodshed, with Rudy's death an unplanned catastrophe and Dora's poisoning a ruthless silencing. The brooch with CB initials, pawned by Rudy, was a tangible link to Charlotte, though she denied owning it. Craddock, his grey eyes narrowed, suspected Patrick and Julia Simmons, the supposed cousins, as Charlotte's accomplices, their polished charm a mask for darker ambitions tied to the Godler fortune. Craddock's latest lead came from London. Patrick and Julia were not siblings, but lovers. Their student personas a fiction crafted to infiltrate Little Paddocks. Patrick, born Peter Langley, had a record of fraud, while Julia, née Justine Leclerc, had charmed her way through European casinos before washing up in England. Their connection to Charlotte, Craddock theorized, was blackmail. She'd paid them to secure her secret, only for their greed to escalate into murder. He needed proof, and with Sonia Godler's death imminent, time was short. A trap, he decided, was the only way to flush them out. Miss Marple, back in Chipping Cleghorn, sat in the Bluebird Café, her tea cooling as she listened to Mrs. Lucas recount the village's latest fears. The café, its windows steamed from the morning rush, buzzed with subdued chatter. "They say Miss Blacklock's not herself," Mrs. Lucas whispered, wiping a counter. "Mrs. Swettenham swears she saw her burning papers in the garden at midnight." Miss Marple, nodding sympathetically, recalled a case in St. Mary Mead where burnt letters hid a killer's motive. "People burn things for all sorts of reasons," she said, her voice mild. "Guilt or fear." Mrs. Lucas, sensing a story, leaned closer, but Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic, her thoughts on Charlotte's trembling hands. At Little Paddocks, the household was a pressure cooker of suspicion. Charlotte, her scarf a constant shield, moved through the day with haunted eyes, her confession to Miss Marple a weight she couldn't shake. Patrick, his motorbike now gleaming in the garage, laughed too loudly, his charm fraying. Julia, her elegance sharper, watched everyone with a predator's gaze, her cigarettes burning down to stubs. Philippa Hames, her knitting a quiet refuge, sensed the storm brewing, her thoughts on her son Pip, the Godler heir if Charlotte's fraud was exposed. Mitzi, her paranoia now a fever, locked every door, her mutterings about devils echoing. Through the kitchen, Craddock, with Miss Marple's counsel, devised a plan to force the accomplice's hand. He visited Little Paddocks, his manner brisk, and announced a fabricated development. Sonia Godler had died that morning, triggering the release of the fortune to Letitia, or Charlotte. "We're verifying her identity," he said, watching the room. Charlotte's face drained of colour, her scarf slipping to reveal the scar Miss Marple had noted. Patrick, polishing a glass, froze, while Julia's cigarette paused mid-air. Philippa, folding laundry, glanced up, her expression unreadable. Mitzi, serving tea, dropped a spoon, her gasp loud in the silence. "The will's clear," Craddock continued, his voice steady. "But we've questions about certain documents. If anyone knows anything, now's the time." He left the bait dangling, his eyes scanning for tells. Charlotte's hands trembled, but she said nothing. Her lips pressed tight. Patrick, recovering, laughed. "Sounds like a lot of fuss over nothing, Inspector." Julia, her voice cool, added, "Aunt Letty's who she says. You're barking up the wrong tree." Craddock, noting their quick recovery, left, confident. The trap was set. Miss Marple, at the vicarage, shared her thoughts with Bunch Harmon over a lunch of shepherd's pie and carrots. The parlour, with its chipped teacups and scent of lavender, was a balm to her nerves. "Charlotte's trapped," she said, her needles clicking. "Her accomplices know she's vulnerable, and with Sonia's death, they'll act." Bunch, slicing pie, frowned. "You think Patrick and Julia are in on it? They're so polished." Miss Marple's smile was wry. "Polish, my dear, is often a veneer. In my village we had a charming man who swindled widows. Charm is a weapon." Bunch shared a tidbit. Edmund Swettenham had seen Julia near the hotel the day Rudy pawned the brooch, her scarf pulled high. "Edmund's sweet on Philippa, so he notices things," Bunch said. Julian Harmon, joining them, cautioned against assumptions. "Julia's aloof, but that's no crime." Miss Marple, spooning carrots, asked about Mitzi's fears. "She's terrified," Bunch said. "Told the butcher she saw a woman with a limp in the garden, same as before." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, recalling Mitzi's earlier claim. A limp, real or imagined, was a detail worth pursuing. Craddock, back at the station, received a report from Sergeant Fletcher. The jeweller had identified Julia from a photograph, confirming she'd inquired about the brooch's value weeks before. Rudy pawned it. The link was damning, tying Julia to Rudy's scheme. Craddock, his pulse quickening, planned a confrontation, but needed Charlotte's cooperation to seal the case. He met Miss Marple at the church, where she was arranging flowers for a harvest festival. The stone walls, cool and damp, echoed their whispers. "Charlotte's breaking," Miss Marple said. "She fears her accomplices more than the law. You must protect her." Craddock, nodding, outlined his trap. Hidden officers would watch. Little Paddocks, waiting for Patrick or Julia to betray themselves. That evening, Little Paddocks crackled with tension. Charlotte, in the drawing-room, stared at the fire, her scarf loose, the scar a stark line against her pale skin. Patrick, entering with a bottle of whiskey, poured a generous measure. "Cheer up, Aunt Letty," he said, his grin forced. "All this fuss will blow over." Charlotte's eyes, haunted, met his. "Will it, Patrick, or will it bury us?" Her voice was a whisper, but Patrick's smile faltered, his hand tightening on the glass. Julia, joining them, lit a cigarette, her movements deliberate. "Stop fretting, both of you," she said. "The police have nothing." Her tone was sharp, but her eyes flicked to the window, as if sensing watchers in the dark. Philippa, in her room, wrote to Pip, her pen steady despite the house's unease. She'd overheard Patrick and Julia whispering in the hall, their voices low but urgent. Something about the money and no more mistakes. Philippa, her heart heavy, wondered if her son's future, tied to the Goodler fortune, was worth the shadow cast by Little Paddocks. Mitzi, in the kitchen, bolted the back door, her knife now a constant companion. "They come for me next," she muttered, her prayers a desperate chant. Craddock's trap sprang at midnight. A constable, hidden in the shrubbery, overheard Patrick confront Charlotte in the study, his voice a hiss through the open window. "You're cracking, Charlotte. If you talk, we're done for." Charlotte's reply was tearful. "I didn't want Rudy dead, Peter. You promised it was just a scare." Patrick's laugh was harsh. He got greedy, wanted more. I had to shut him up. The constable, signalling colleagues, crept closer, recording every word. Charlotte, sobbing, said, "And Dora, you let Justine do that." Patrick's voice dropped. She had to. Bunny was too close with her Lottie nonsense. Before the police could move, Julia appeared, her silhouette sharp in the doorway. "Enough, Peter!" she snapped. "You're making it worse!" She grabbed Charlotte's arm, her grip tight. "You'll keep quiet, won't you, darling? For all our sakes." Charlotte, trembling, nodded, but her eyes were wild with fear. The police, bursting in, caught Patrick mid-sentence, his face blanching as Craddock stepped forward, handcuffs gleaming. "Peter Langley, Justine Leclerc, you're under arrest for the murders of Rudy Sherds and Dora Bunner," Craddock said, his voice steel. Julia, her composure cracking, lunged for the door. But Fletcher blocked her, his grip firm. Charlotte, collapsing into a chair, wept, her scarf falling away. "I didn't want this," she gasped. "I just wanted a life." Craddock, his expression softening, assured her she'd have a chance to explain. Philippa, drawn by the commotion, stood in the hall, her face pale but resolute. Mitzi, peering from the kitchen, crossed herself, her fear giving way to relief. The police, escorting Patrick and Julia to the van, moved with quiet efficiency, the night swallowing their footsteps. Miss Marple, informed by Craddock at dawn, sat in the vicarage, her knitting untouched. Bunch, brewing tea, was agog. Patrick and Julia lovers, and Charlotte not Letitia. It's like a novel. Julian, stirring his tea, sighed. Poor souls, all of them, caught in their own lies. Miss Marple, her eyes distant, reflected on greed's corrosive power. They wanted the fortune, she said, but it cost them everything. She recalled a St. Mary Mead widow, undone by a similar lust for wealth, and shook her head. In the village, the news spread like wildfire. At the Bluebird Café, Mrs. Lucas regaled patrons with exaggerated tales of the arrest, while Miss Hinchcliffe, buying eggs, nodded approvingly. "Told you it was the household, Amy," she said. Amy, clutching her basket, smiled weakly. I knew those shadows meant something. Edmund Swettenham, visiting Philippa, offered quiet support, his love unspoken but clear. "You're free of it now," he said. Philippa, her eyes on the horizon, nodded, her son's future brighter with Charlotte's truth exposed. Craddock, at the station, interviewed Charlotte, who detailed the scheme. Patrick and Julia, learning her secret through a forged letter from Switzerland, had coerced her into the murder stunt, promising protection for a share of the fortune. Rudy, hired as a pawn, was killed when he demanded a larger cut. Patrick's bullet swift and final. Dora, suspecting Charlotte's identity, was poisoned by Julia, her cyanide-laced tea a silent execution. Charlotte, broken, agreed to testify, her fear of prison outweighed by guilt. As the sun rose, Chipping Cleghorn exhaled, its secrets laid bare. Little Paddocks stood quiet, its windows catching the light. Charlotte, in custody, faced an uncertain future, her false life unravelling. Philippa, packing her bags, planned to move with Pip, the Gödler fortune now his by right. Mitzi, humming, in the kitchen dreamed of returning home, her knife stowed. Miss Marple, boarding the bus to Meddenham Wells, folded her knitting, her work done. The village, scarred but healing, resumed its rhythm, the frost melting under a tentative sun, as if the truth, though painful, had set it free.